The Columbia drifted silently through the darkness of space, her hull reflecting the distant stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge with his arms crossed, watching the main view screen display an endless field of nothing. They had been out here for 6 months, charting systems that no human had ever seen, collecting data on planets that might one day become homes for Earth's growing population. It was routine work, the kind that made some crew members restless and others grateful for the peace. Jake was neither restless nor particularly grateful. He simply did his job. At 42 years old, he had spent half his life in space, working his way up from a junior navigation officer to commanding his own vessel. The Columbia was not a warship. She carried scientists and researchers, people who studied rocks and gases and the mathematical patterns of stellar formation. But Jake had served in the military before joining the civilian space program, and he never forgot that space could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with radiation or asteroid fields. Dr. Lisa Harper walked onto the bridge carrying a data pad, her red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was the chief xenobiologist, which was a fancy title for someone who studied the possibility of alien life. So far in her career, she had studied a lot of possibilities and 0 actual aliens. That was about to change. Jake noticed her expression before she said anything. Lisa had a tell when something important happened. Her left eyebrow would rise just slightly and she would bite her lower lip. She was doing both now. She handed him the data pad without a word. Jake looked at the screen and felt his stomach tighten. The sensors had picked up something big, something that was definitely not natural. The object was roughly 2 kilometers long, angular and purposeful in design, and it was moving toward them at a speed that suggested advanced propulsion technology. Jake looked at Lisa, and she nodded. They both knew what this meant. After decades of searching and wondering and hoping and fearing, humanity was about to meet someone else. Jake turned to his communications officer, a young woman named Beth Rogers who had joined the crew fresh out of the academy. Her hands were already moving across her console before he could give the order. Beth transmitted a simple message, a mathematical sequence that any intelligent species would recognize as deliberate communication. It was the same message that Earth had been broadcasting into space for over a century. A peaceful greeting that said, "We are here, and we mean no harm." The response came faster than anyone expected. The alien ship altered course and accelerated directly toward the Columbia. Within minutes, 2 more ships appeared on sensors, flanking the first in a formation that Jake recognized from his military days. It was an attack pattern. The lead ship was now close enough for visual confirmation. Jake ordered the main screen to display the actual image rather than the sensor interpretation. What he saw made him understand that humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and that whoever these newcomers were, they were not impressed by what they found. The alien vessel looked like something between a scorpion and a cathedral, all sharp angles and crystalline surfaces that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Weapon ports lined its hull in regular intervals, too many to count at a glance. This was not a research ship or a trader or an explorer. This was something built for one purpose only. A transmission came through, but it was not like anything the Columbia's computers had encountered before. The signal contained layers of information, visual and auditory and mathematical, all woven together in a complex pattern. Beth worked frantically to decode even a portion of it. What came through on the main screen was an image of a being that made several crew members gasp. It stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in scales that looked like polished stone. Its eyes were solid black, without visible pupils, and when it opened its mouth to speak, Jake saw rows of teeth designed for tearing meat. The creature wore armor that seemed to be part decoration and part functional protection. With symbols that might have been rank insignia or family crests or something, humanity had no context to understand. The translation software struggled to make sense of the alien's words, but the tone was clear enough. This was not a friendly greeting. The being spoke for approximately 30 seconds, its voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ship's speakers. When it finished, the transmission ended abruptly. Lisa worked with Beth to piece together a rough translation. The alien had identified itself as War Prince Thraken of the Velcrin Dominion. It had declared the Columbia and its crew to be trespassers in Dominion space. It had demanded that the humans return to their world immediately and never venture into this region again. And finally, It had stated that failure to comply would result in what the translation software rendered as either immediate destruction or immediate cleansing. The exact meaning was unclear. Jake made a decision in the span of 5 seconds. He ordered Beth to transmit another message, this one explaining that the Columbia came in peace, that humanity did not know this space was claimed, and that they would be happy to establish diplomatic relations with the Velcrin Dominion. He tried to sound respectful without sounding weak, a balance he had learned during his military service. The response was not a transmission. The response was weapons fire. 3 beams of brilliant green energy lanced out from the lead Velcrin ship, crossing the distance between them in less than a second. The Columbia's proximity alarm screamed warnings that came too late to matter. The beams struck the forward shields and the entire ship shuddered like a dog shaking off water. Paul Bennett, the chief engineer, was already shouting reports from his station. The shields were holding, but barely. They had absorbed energy equivalent to a direct nuclear blast, and they were not designed to take that kind of punishment. Another hit like that would overwhelm the defensive grid, and the next shot would turn the Columbia into expanding vapor. Jake did not hesitate. He ordered an emergency hyperspace jump, knowing it was dangerous to make such a transition without proper calculations, but more dangerous to stay where they were. The Columbia's experimental jump drive, a technology that was still being tested and refined, powered up in under 10 seconds. Space around the ship began to twist and fold in ways that human eyes were not meant to perceive. The Velcrin ships fired again, but this time the beams passed through the space where the Columbia had been a moment before. The human ship vanished, leaving behind only a faint ripple in the fabric of reality, and 3 very confused alien warships. Inside the Columbia, Jake held onto his command chair as the ship bounced through hyperspace like a stone skipping across water. The journey that should have taken days happened in minutes, and when they finally dropped back into normal space, every crew member was either throwing up or fighting the urge to throw up, but they were alive and they were heading home. Jake stood up on unsteady legs and addressed his crew. He told them that they had just made first contact with an alien species, that those aliens had attacked without provocation, and that Earth needed to know what was coming. He did not sugarcoat the situation. The Velcrin had ships that could destroy the Columbia with ease, and they clearly saw humanity as something to be eliminated, rather than welcomed. Lisa came to stand beside Jake as the crew worked to stabilize their course. She asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. She asked if the Velcrin would follow them home. Jake looked at the view screen, at the familiar stars that marked the way back to Earth. He thought about the 3 alien warships they had left behind, about the casual way the Velcrin had opened fire, about the message that humanity was not wanted in this galaxy. He thought about all of this, and he gave Lisa the only honest answer he could. He told her he did not know, but that Earth needed to be ready either way. The galaxy had just attacked humanity, and humanity needed to prepare to fight back. The Columbia limped into Earth orbit 3 weeks after the encounter, her hull scorched and her crew exhausted. Jake Morrison had transmitted his report ahead of their arrival, and by the time they docked at Luna Station, the entire solar system was already mobilizing for war. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency session that lasted 18 hours, and when it ended, humanity had made a decision that would change everything. They would not hide, they would not run, and they would not beg for mercy from an enemy that had already shown none. Admiral Claire Davis received her new orders while standing on the observation deck of the orbital command station above Earth. She was 56 years old, a career military officer who had spent the last 30 years preparing for a threat that most people thought would never come. She had argued for decades that humanity needed to arm itself against the possibility of hostile alien contact, and she had been called paranoid and wasteful, and a warmonger by politicians who thought the money could be better spent elsewhere. Now those same politicians were begging her to save them. Claire looked down at Earth, at the blue and white sphere that held 8 billion souls who had no idea how close they were to extinction. The Velcrin were coming. The intelligence analysis made that clear. Species that attacked on sight would not ignore the survivors who escaped. They would hunt them down and finish what they started. The only question was when they would arrive and how many ships they would bring. The answer came sooner than anyone expected. 6 weeks after the Columbia's return, Long-range sensors picked up a massive hyperspace signature at the edge of the solar system. 50 Velcrin warships dropped into normal space near Neptune's orbit and began their approach toward Earth. They moved in a tight formation, clearly confident that nothing could stop them. Claire stood in the command center deep inside Luna Station, surrounded by displays showing every ship and weapon platform in the solar system. Her staff worked quietly and efficiently, updating tactical data and coordinating with ship commanders spread across millions of kilometers. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in simulations, but the real thing felt different. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. War Prince Thraken led the Velcrin fleet from his flagship, a massive vessel called the Eternal Dominance that was twice the size of anything humanity had ever built. He had volunteered for this mission personally, eager to erase the humiliation of letting the human ship escape. The Dominion High Council had been furious when he reported that the primitive species had somehow evaded his weapons and fled. They had questioned his competence and his courage, and the only way to restore his honor was to bring proof of humanity's complete destruction. Thraken studied the tactical display showing the inner solar system. His sensors detected some orbital platforms around the human homeworld and a handful of small ships scattered among the nearby planets. It was pathetic, barely worth the effort of deploying his full fleet. He had brought 50 warships to crush an enemy that appeared to have fewer than 20 vessels. The battle would be over in minutes. What Thraken did not know was that humanity had learned the art of deception long before they reached the stars. Every civilization on Earth had practiced it, from ancient generals who hid soldiers in wooden horses, to modern commanders who used electronic warfare to mask their true strength. Admiral Davis had spent 3 decades preparing for this exact scenario, and she had no intention of showing the enemy everything she had. The Velcrin fleet crossed the orbit of Jupiter, passing within range of what appeared to be a small mining station on one of the moons. Thraken barely glanced at it, his attention focused on the approaching homeworld where his prey awaited. He did not notice when the mining station's exterior panels fell away, revealing weapons batteries that had been hidden beneath false plating. He did not notice until those weapons opened fire. The first railgun shot crossed 300,000 kilometers in 8 seconds and struck a Velcrin cruiser amidships. The projectile had been accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, and when it hit, the kinetic energy converted instantly to heat. The cruiser's shields flared and failed, unable to handle a weapon that had no energy signature to deflect. The tungsten rod punched through the hull and exited the other side, leaving a hole the size of a small house. The ship's internal atmosphere vented explosively, and secondary explosions began to tear through its engineering section. Thraken's tactical officer shouted a warning, but it was already too late. All around Jupiter's orbit, dozens of hidden platforms revealed themselves and began firing. The asteroids that the Velcrin had dismissed as natural debris were actually camouflaged weapons emplacements. The small ships they had detected were decoys, transmitting false signatures while the real human fleet waited in ambush. 300 human warships emerged from concealment, their positions carefully chosen to create overlapping fields of fire. They had been waiting in the shadows of moons, hiding behind asteroids, using every trick that generations of human warfare had developed. Now they struck with coordinated precision that made the Velcrin formation look clumsy by comparison. Commander Ryan Foster flew his fighter wing out of a concealed bay on Mars, leading 48 craft that the Velcrin sensors had somehow missed entirely. His Hornet was small and fast, built for speed rather than armor, and it carried a payload that would have terrified him if he had time to think about it. Instead, he focused on his targeting display and the enemy cruiser that his squadron had been assigned to kill. Ryan's fighters split into 3 groups, approaching the cruiser from different angles to divide its defensive fire. The Velcrin point defense systems tracked them and began shooting, filling space with energy bolts that looked like green fireflies in the darkness. 2 of Ryan's pilots died in the first 5 seconds, their fighters vaporizing when direct hits overwhelmed their minimal shielding. Ryan did not have time to mourn them. He had a job to finish. The remaining fighters closed to within 1,000 meters of the cruiser's hull, so close that the enemy weapons could not track them effectively. Ryan armed his payload and designated the target point on the cruiser's engineering section. 46 nuclear-tipped missiles launched simultaneously, each one guided by an artificial intelligence that could outthink any point defense system. The missiles swarmed the cruiser like angry hornets, evading defensive fire and detonating in a carefully timed sequence that created a cascading failure along the entire length of the ship. The cruiser broke, apart in a flash of light that briefly rivaled the distant sun. Ryan pulled his fighter away from the expanding debris field and checked his tactical display. His squadron had lost 8 pilots, but they had killed their target. All across the battlefield, similar scenes played out as human fighters overwhelmed Velcrin ships with tactics that had never been seen before in galactic warfare. Thraken watched his fleet being torn apart and felt something he had never experienced in 40 years of military service. He felt fear. The humans were not fighting like primitives or prey animals running from predators. They were fighting like apex predators who had been waiting for challengers to arrive. Every weapon they used was different from the last. Every tactic unexpected. Every attack coordinated with a precision that suggested they had been planning this battle for years. A human dreadnought. One of the largest ships in their fleet fired a weapon that Thraken did not recognize. It looked like a simple laser at first, but when it struck one of his battleships, the effect was catastrophic. The laser did not burn through the hull. Instead, it seemed to excite something at the molecular level, causing the ship's armor to superheat from within. Within seconds, the entire vessel was glowing white-hot, and then it simply came apart as its structural integrity failed. Admiral Davis watched the battle unfold from her command center, her expression calm despite the chaos on the displays. She had lost 12 ships so far, and the number was climbing, but the Velcrin had lost 38. The mathematics were clear. Humanity was winning. She opened a channel to all human forces and gave the order she had been waiting decades to deliver. She told them to press the attack, to show no mercy, and to make sure that any Velcrin who survived would carry a message back to their empire. The message was simple. Earth was not easy prey, and anyone who attacked humanity would learn to regret it. The battle raged for another 2 hours before the remaining Velcrin ships broke formation and fled. Thraken's flagship was heavily damaged, its shields depleted and its weapons offline. He ordered the retreat with shame burning in his chest, knowing that he would face judgment from the High Council for this disaster. But survival came first, and explanations could wait until he was safely back in Dominion space. As the Velcrin fleet jumped away, Claire allowed herself a small smile. The enemy had learned an important lesson today, but she knew it was not over. Pride would bring them back, and next time they would come with more ships and better preparation. That was fine. Humanity would be ready. They had been ready for this fight since the first human picked up a rock to defend their family from a predator. The Velcrin thought they were the predators in this scenario, but they were about to learn what it meant to hunt something that could hunt them back. The Velcrin Dominion High Council met in their grand chamber on the homeworld of Velcra Prime, a room carved from solid crystal that reflected light in patterns meant to inspire awe and obedience. 12 council members sat in their designated positions, each one representing a different military branch or conquered territory. They had ruled this sector of space for 5,000 years, crushing any species that dared challenge their authority. Now they faced something they had never encountered before, an enemy that refused to be crushed. War Prince Thraken stood in the center of the chamber, his armor still scorched from battle, his pride in ruins. He had just finished his report on the failed invasion of the human homeworld, and the silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. The council members looked at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to contempt. Elder Matriarch Shivra, the oldest and most powerful member of the council, finally spoke. Her voice was cold enough to freeze hydrogen. She asked Thraken how 50 warships could lose to a species that had never left its own star system before. She asked how beings that the Dominion had dismissed as primitive animals could destroy 38 H vessels and force the survivors to flee. She asked if Thraken was a coward or simply incompetent, and she made it clear that both options led to the same punishment. Thraken stood straight and did not flinch. He had expected this reaction, and he had prepared his response carefully. He told the council that they had underestimated humanity, that these beings fought with weapons and tactics the Dominion had never seen, that they used their weakness as strength and turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. He told them that the humans had been planning for this war long before the Dominion knew they existed, and that sending another fleet without proper preparation would only lead to more deaths. The council did not want to hear about human cleverness or preparation. They wanted revenge, and they wanted it immediately. They authorized Operation Final Judgment, a fleet of 500 warships supported by 10,000 ground troops in case the orbital assault somehow failed. They would glass the human homeworld from space and eliminate every trace of this species that had dared to humiliate the Dominion. Thrackan was ordered to accompany the fleet as an advisor, which everyone understood was a polite way of ensuring he witnessed the redemption of Velcrin honor or died trying. 6 months passed while the Dominion assembled its invasion force. 6 months during which humanity did not sit idle and wait for death to arrive. Admiral Claire Davis had been promoted to Supreme Commander of all human military forces, and she used her new authority to transform the solar system into a fortress that would make the previous defenses look like children's toys. General Marcus Webb oversaw the militarization of every human colony. Luna Base expanded its shipyards to produce 1 new warship every 3 days. Mars Colony converted its mining operations to extract materials for weapons manufacturing. The settlements on Europa and Titan became armed military installations, each one capable of supporting a fleet. Even the asteroid belt was weaponized, with rocks hollowed out and filled with automated defense systems that could operate independently for years. Dr. Henry Pierce worked in a secure laboratory deep beneath the surface of the moon, leading a team of scientists who had been given unlimited resources and one simple directive. He needed to create a weapon that could turn the tide of the coming war, something that would make the Velcrin regret ever hearing the word human. What his team developed was based on theoretical physics that most scientists thought was decades away from practical application. They called it the Graviton Lance, and the first test nearly destroyed the laboratory. The weapon worked by manipulating gravitational fields at a localized point, creating intense tidal forces that could tear apart molecular bonds. When fired at a ship, it did not punch through armor or burn through shields. Instead, it made the target tear itself apart from the inside as different sections experienced wildly different gravitational pulls. The problem was that generating such precise gravitational manipulation required enormous amounts of energy, and the recoil effect was almost as dangerous to the firing ship as the weapon was to the target. Henry's team worked day and night to solve the stability problems. They reinforced the weapon housing with materials that could withstand the stress. They added cooling systems to prevent the generator from melting, and they programmed safety protocols that would shut down the weapon if it threatened to destroy its own ship. After 5 months of testing and refinement, they had a working prototype that was ready to be installed on a warship. Admiral Davis chose the dreadnought Washington for the honor, and its captain, Nina Brooks, volunteered to test the weapon in actual combat. Nina was 38 years old and had commanded the Washington for 2 years. She was known throughout the fleet for her calm demeanor under pressure and her willingness to take calculated risks. When she first saw the Graviton Lance installed in her ship's main weapon bay, she understood that calculated risk was about to take on a whole new meaning. The weapon was enormous, taking up space that had previously held 3 conventional railgun batteries, and it drew so much power that the ship's other systems had to be throttled back when it fired. The Velcrin invasion fleet arrived exactly when human intelligence predicted it would. 500 warships dropped out of hyperspace in a coordinated formation that stretched across millions of kilometers. The fleet commander, a veteran warrior named Supreme Admiral Krath, had studied the reports from the previous battle and adjusted his tactics accordingly. His ships maintained defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire. His scouts swept ahead looking for hidden weapons platforms, and his orders were clear that no ship would break formation no matter what tricks the humans attempted. What Krath did not account for was that humanity had spent 6 months preparing a welcome that would make the previous battle look like a minor skirmish. The moment the Velcrin fleet emerged from hyperspace, they found themselves in a kill zone that had been meticulously planned and perfectly executed. Millions of autonomous mines activated simultaneously, each one equipped with simple but effective guidance systems and nuclear warheads. They swarmed toward the Velcrin formation like schools of metallic fish, too numerous for the point defense systems to track. Explosions blossomed throughout the enemy fleet as mines found their targets, overwhelming shields through sheer numbers and creating gaps in the defensive formation. Human warships emerged from hiding positions all around the solar system. They had been waiting in the shadow of planets, concealed in the rings of Saturn, buried in the ice of comets that the Velcrin had dismissed as natural objects. 400 ships converged on the enemy fleet from multiple directions, their attack timed with precision that came from months of simulation and practice. Captain Nina Brooks brought the Washington into firing range of the Velcrin flagship. Her tactical officer had identified it as the largest ship in the enemy formation, and therefore the most important target. Nina gave the order to charge the graviton lance, and every member of her crew felt the ship's power systems groan under the sudden drain. Lights dimmed throughout the vessel as the weapon drew energy from every available source. The targeting computer locked onto the flagship and displayed a firing solution. Nina took a deep breath and gave the command. The graviton lance fired with a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep thrumming that resonated through the Washington's hull, like the heartbeat of some vast creature. On the main view screen, the effect was immediate and horrifying. The Velcrin flagship, a vessel 3 kilometers long and built to withstand direct hits from any conventional weapon, simply crumpled. Its forward section folded inward as if grabbed by an invisible hand, metal screaming as gravitational forces tore through structural supports. The middle section twisted in the opposite direction, creating a spiral pattern that would have been beautiful if it were not so deadly. Within 5 seconds, the mighty flagship had been reduced to a compacted ball of wreckage that began drifting away from the battlefield. The Washington shuddered violently as the weapon's recoil effect hit, and for a moment Nina thought her ship would tear itself apart just like the target had. Alarms screamed throughout the vessel as systems struggled to compensate for the gravitational backlash, but Henry's safety protocols held. The weapon shut down automatically, and after several terrifying seconds, the ship stabilized. Nina opened a fleet-wide channel and reported that the graviton lance worked as designed. She recommended that all ships maintain a safe distance from her position, because she intended to fire again as soon as the weapon recharged. The battle raged for 3 full days. Human forces lost 40 ships and thousands of lives, but the Velcrin lost 380 vessels, and those that survived were damaged and demoralized. Supreme Admiral Krath died when his command ship was hit by a coordinated strike from 12 human destroyers. The remaining Velcrin commanders argued among themselves about whether to continue the assault or retreat, and while they argued, humanity continued to destroy their fleet. On the 4th day, the surviving Velcrin ships jumped away in a disorganized retreat that looked more like a rout. They fled in every direction, desperate to escape the humans who had shattered 2 invasion fleets and killed thousands of Dominion warriors. Some ships made it back to Velcrin space. Others were picked off by pursuing human forces, and a few simply vanished into the depths of space, never to be heard from again. Admiral Davis stood in her command center and watched the enemy flee. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, but only a moment. The war was far from over, and she knew that the Velcrin would not stop attacking until they were forced to accept peace. That meant taking the fight to them, finding their homeworld, and making them understand that humanity would not be pushed around by anyone. 8 months had passed since the second Velcrin invasion fleet had been destroyed, and humanity was no longer content to simply defend their home. Admiral Claire Davis stood before the United Nations Security Council and presented a plan that would have been considered insane just 2 years earlier. She wanted to take a fleet deep into Velcrin space, locate their homeworld, and force them to surrender by threatening the very heart of their empire. The council members listened in stunned silence as she explained that defensive victories were not enough, that the Velcrin would keep coming until they were convinced that humanity could strike back at any target in the galaxy. The vote was close, but ultimately the council approved her plan. Claire was given command of a task force consisting of 30 warships, enough to cause significant damage but small enough to move quickly through enemy territory. Her flagship would be the Carrier Enterprise, a newly constructed vessel that incorporated every lesson learned from the previous battles. The ship carried advanced sensors, improved weapons, and most importantly, a crew that had been training for exactly this kind of mission. Commander Kyle Sanders joined the task force as the Chief Intelligence Officer, his role critical to the mission's success. Kyle was 34 years old and had spent the last decade studying alien psychology and military tactics, preparing for contact with species that humanity had only theorized about. When the war with the Velcrin began, his expertise suddenly became invaluable. He had personally interrogated 15 captured Velcrin soldiers, using a combination of psychological techniques and Strategic negotiation to extract information that traditional interrogation methods would have missed, through careful analysis of everything the prisoners said and everything they refused to say. Kyle had pieced together the location of Velcro Prime. The Velcran homeworld was protected by 200 warships in permanent defensive positions, along with orbital platforms that could destroy approaching fleets. But Kyle had also learned something more valuable than tactical data. He had learned how the Velcran thought, how their rigid hierarchical society made certain decisions predictable, and how their pride could be used against them. The human task force departed from Mars orbit on a cold morning in March, watched by millions of people who understood that this mission would either end the war or escalate it to unimaginable levels. Claire addressed her crews before they left, telling them that they were not going to Velcran space to commit genocide or to become conquerors. They were going to demonstrate that humanity could reach any target they chose, and that peace was in everyone's best interest. The journey took 6 weeks, with the fleet making multiple jumps through hyperspace and avoiding known Velcran patrol routes. Along the way, they encountered other species for the first time, civilizations that had been enslaved by the Velcran Dominion for generations. These encounters changed everything that humanity thought they knew about the galactic political situation. On the 4th week of their journey, the task force stopped at a planet called Tyrannus 4 to gather intelligence and resupply. The planet was home to an insectoid species called the Tyrannus, beings that stood about 5 feet tall with 4 arms and compound eyes that could see wavelengths of light invisible to humans. They had been conquered by the Velcran 300 years earlier and forced to provide resources and labor to support the Dominion's military expansion. Lieutenant Amy Chen led a ground team that made first contact with the Tyrannus resistance movement. Amy was a linguist and cultural specialist who had learned 6 Earth languages before she turned 20. And she approached the Tyrannus with a combination of caution and genuine curiosity. The Tyrannus leaders were initially suspicious of yet another species making promises they could not keep. But when Amy showed them recordings of human victories against the Velcran, everything changed. The Tyrannus resistance leader, a being whose name translated roughly as clicking wings in sunlight, could barely believe what the recordings showed. The Velcran were supposed to be invincible, their technology superior to anything other species possessed, their military tactics refined over millennia of conquest. Yet here were humans, relative newcomers to space travel, destroying Velcran fleets with weapons and strategies that seemed to break every rule of galactic warfare. Amy explained that humanity was heading to Velcro Prime to end the war, and she asked if the Tyrannus would be willing to provide intelligence about Velcran defensive systems. In exchange, humanity would share technology and promise to help liberate any species still under Dominion control. Clicking wings in sunlight did not need to consult with anyone before agreeing. The chance to strike back at their oppressors was worth any risk. The intelligence provided by the Tyrannus proved invaluable. They revealed that the Velcran defense grid around their homeworld operated on a centralized control system, a weakness born from the Dominion's belief that no enemy would ever reach their capital. The Velcran had never imagined needing to defend against a sophisticated cyber attack because they had never encountered a species with comparable computer technology. Humanity was about to teach them another painful lesson. Dr. Sophie Blake, the fleet's chief cyber warfare specialist, spent 2 weeks analyzing the Tyrannus data and developing a virus specifically designed to infiltrate Velcran computer systems. Sophie was 29 years old and had been recruited by military intelligence straight out of university after she accidentally hacked into a government database while looking for publicly available research papers. Now her skills were being used to create a weapon that could disable an entire planet's defenses without firing a single shot. The virus Sophie created was elegant in its simplicity. It did not try to destroy Velcran systems or take them over completely. Instead, it introduced subtle timing errors that would cascade through their network. Defense platforms would fire a fraction of a second too late. Targeting computers would miscalculate trajectories by tiny margins, and communication systems would experience brief delays that disrupted coordination. Individually, these errors would be barely noticeable, but collectively they would turn a sophisticated defense grid into a liability. The human task force arrived at Velcro Prime exactly 3 months after leaving Earth. Claire ordered the fleet to exit hyperspace at maximum weapons range, giving them time to assess the situation before committing to battle. What they saw on their sensors was both impressive and daunting. The Velcrin homeworld was beautiful, a planet covered in crystalline cities that sparkled in the light of their star, surrounded by defensive installations that represented centuries of military engineering. The Velcrin home fleet detected the human ships immediately and began moving to intercept positions. 200 warships, each one crewed by warriors who were defending their families and their history, prepared to drive the invaders away from their sacred world. The Velcrin had lost 2 major battles in human space, but this was different. This was their home, and they would fight with desperation that came from having nowhere left to retreat. Claire watched the enemy fleet organize itself and knew that a direct assault would be suicide. The human task force was outnumbered nearly 7-1, and even with superior weapons and tactics, those odds were impossible to overcome. But she had not come here to fight a conventional battle. She opened a secure channel to Commander Sanders and gave him authorization to proceed with his part of the mission. Kyle's stealth ship, a small vessel coated in materials that absorbed sensor waves and made it nearly invisible, detached from the Enterprise and began moving toward the planet. His crew consisted of only 5 people, all of them specialists in infiltration and electronic warfare. Their mission was simple in concept but terrifyingly difficult in execution. They needed to get close enough to the Velcrin defense network to upload Sophie's virus without being detected by sensors or visually spotted by patrol ships. The stealth ship drifted through the defensive perimeter like a ghost, its engines running at minimal power to avoid creating a heat signature that might give away its position. Kyle sat in the pilot's seat and manually controlled every movement, using microbursts from maneuvering thrusters to adjust their course. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and they would be vaporized by weapons platforms that were programmed to destroy anything that came too close. It took 4 hours to reach the primary communication relay that controlled the defense grid. 4 hours during which Kyle and his crew barely breathed, watching their sensors for any indication that they had been spotted. When they finally arrived at the relay, Sophie activated the upload sequence and waited while her virus infiltrated the Velcrin network. The upload took 90 seconds, though it felt like 90 years to everyone aboard the stealth ship. When Sophie confirmed that the virus had successfully integrated itself into the Velcrin systems, Kyle reversed course and began the equally dangerous journey back to the fleet. They made it halfway before a Velcrin patrol ship passed close enough to detect their thermal signature. Alarms sounded throughout the stealth ship as the patrol vessel locked weapons and prepared to fire. Kyle made a split-second decision and fired his own engines at full power, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. The stealth ship accelerated away from the patrol vessel, racing toward the safety of the human fleet while enemy fire chased them through space. The Velcrin home fleet saw the stealth ship being pursued and realized that humans had infiltrated their defenses. They immediately attempted to run diagnostic checks on their systems, but Sophie's virus was already active and causing subtle disruptions that made those diagnostics unreliable. By the time the Velcrin aimed weapons at each other, decades of military training demanding that they treat each other as enemies. Then Thrackan lowered his weapon and spoke in broken English, words he had learned by studying transmissions from captured human equipment. He told Greg that the weapons must be stopped, that his own leaders had gone insane with pride, and that he would rather die helping humans than live to see his homeworld destroyed by ancient technology that nobody understood. Greg made a decision that would later be studied in military academies across human space. He lowered his own weapon and accepted Thrackan's help. Together, humans and Velcrin worked to access the control systems of the ancient weapon, combining human technical knowledge with Velcrin understanding of their own archaeological discoveries. Above them, Nina fired the graviton lance with the modified settings that Henry had provided. The weapon discharged with a sound like reality itself tearing, and for several terrible seconds everyone aboard the Washington thought they had made a fatal mistake. The ship bucked and twisted as gravitational forces pulled it in multiple directions, and crew members held onto their stations with white-knuckled grips. But the plan worked. The gravitational field created by the lance dampened the energy draw from the planet's core, reducing the weapon's output by 70%. Seismic activity across Velcra Prime decreased immediately, and the danger of core destabilization began to fade. Nina's crew cheered, but she knew the job was not finished. 5 more weapon sites remained active, and the Washington needed time to recharge before it could fire again. Deep in the facility, Greg and Thraken reached the main control chamber. The ancient systems were like nothing either of them had seen before. Crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light and responded to touch in ways that suggested they were partially alive. Thraken explained that his people had activated the weapons by simply touching certain patterns on the control surfaces, but they had never learned how to deactivate them. Greg studied the patterns and noticed something that Thraken had missed. The control surfaces showed mathematical sequences, and while the symbols were alien, the underlying mathematics was universal. He recognized prime numbers, geometric progressions, and ratios that appeared throughout nature. Working quickly, he traced out a sequence on the crystalline surface that represented a shutdown command in the most basic, mathematical language imaginable. The weapon powered down with a deep, thrumming sound that shook the entire facility. Emergency lighting activated throughout the chamber, and display panels showed system status reports in a language that nobody present could read, but which clearly indicated reduced power levels. Greg and Thraken looked at each other, two warriors from different worlds who had just saved billions of lives by choosing cooperation over conflict. The remaining weapon sites were shut down over the next 6 hours, some by Marine teams working with Velcrin soldiers, others by the Washington's repeated use of the Graviton Lance. By the time all 6 sites were inactive, Velcro Prime was scarred by earthquakes and fires, but the planet itself was stable, and its population had survived. Elder Matriarch Shivra was arrested by her own security forces, who had decided that attempting planetary suicide was grounds for immediate removal from power. The remaining council members, shaken by how close they had come to total annihilation, contacted Admiral Davis and offered unconditional surrender. Claire accepted their surrender but made her terms clear. The Velcrin Dominion would be dissolved. All vassal species would be freed immediately. Any future aggression against human interests would result in immediate military response, and war criminals responsible for unprovoked attacks on humanity would face trial. She also demanded that Velcro Prime provide full technological and historical records to help humanity understand the ancient weapons that had nearly destroyed everything. 3 months later, a galactic summit was held on a neutral station that had been constructed specifically for this purpose. Representatives from 40 different species attended, eager to understand how humanity had defeated the seemingly invincible Velcrin Dominion in less than 2 years of warfare. Ambassador Karen Foster represented humanity at the summit. She was a career diplomat who had spent years preparing for first contact, though she had always imagined it would be more peaceful than what actually occurred. Now she stood before an audience of alien dignitaries and explained what made humanity different from other species they had encountered. She told them that humans came from a world that was actively hostile to life, a planet where nature tried constantly to kill them through weather, predators, diseases, and disasters. She explained that humanity survived by being adaptable, by learning from every failure, and by refusing to accept defeat as final. She described how human civilization was built on the idea that problems existed to be solved, not accepted. War Prince Thraken attended the summit as well, representing the new Velcrin government that had formed after the dissolution of the Dominion. He spoke honestly about his species' failures, admitting that the Velcrin had grown arrogant after centuries of easy victories over weaker civilizations. He described watching humans fight with creativity and determination that the Dominion had never encountered, using weapons and tactics that broke every rule of conventional galactic warfare. The summit concluded with the signing of multiple treaties that reshaped galactic politics. Humanity was recognized as a sovereign power with full rights to explore and settle any unclaimed systems. The former vassal species of the Velcrin Dominion formed their own governments, many of them signing mutual defense pacts with Earth. And new protocols were established for first contact situations, designed to prevent the kind of immediate hostility that had started the war. Captain Jake Morrison returned to Earth and visited the memorial park that had been built to honor the 15,000 humans who died during the war. He walked among the names carved in stone and thought about everything that had changed since the Columbia had encountered those first Velcrin warships. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and they were no longer naive about what that meant. He looked up at the night sky, at stars that now represented not just distant suns but potential neighbors and allies, and maybe future enemies. The galaxy had tried to exterminate humanity because they thought humans were weak and insignificant. They had learned, through blood and fire and ultimately through cooperation, that humanity's greatest strength was not in their weapons or ships, but in their refusal to give up when things seemed hopeless. The Velcrin had attacked Earth expecting an easy victory, but they discovered that attacking humanity was the biggest mistake they could have made. The galaxy had learned its lesson, and humanity had earned its place among the stars.